it's always dangerous when I try and speak to something that I don't have a lot of schooling in. But when she talked about the wisdom of nature, living according to natural law, the wisdom of the health associated with nature, if you contrast that with what they're doing with genetic engineering, we all know about the birds and the bees, and you create a lot of different types of corn and a lot of different types of pigs and dogs and whatnot. But you can take pig genes and put them into tomatoes. They have taken spider genes and put them into goats in the hope that they can milk the goat to get spiderweb protein to make bulletproof vests. They're doing this. They've taken human genes and put it into corn to make spermicide. They've taken human genes and put it into pigs, and the pigs get big and hard, they get arthritis. They've released genetically modified mosquitoes in 3 countries. They want to release genetically modified salmon. They want to change the natural organisms which are part of life. And they're doing it for profit. The primary reason why that they genetically engineer food crops is to sell more poisonous weed killer. Let me explain. There's a company called Monsanto. You've heard? Well, my work is done here tonight. Voted the most hated company on earth for 11 straight years, with stiff competition, I might add. They told us that PCBs were safe, and Agent Orange was safe, and DDT was safe. And they get to determine entirely on their own whether their genetically engineered foods are safe. The government doesn't require safety studies. It doesn't require labeling. They can put it into our baby food, infant formula, our own food, without telling us or the government. So they had a very successful weed killer called Roundup. And they have been lying about Roundup for years, and I don't use that word lightly. We have evidence. And they hid information about its link to birth defects, and they tried to say that it was biodegradable, and they got convicted in a court in New York because it's not biodegradable, but they continued to pretend that it was in Europe until the French Supreme Court convicted them of lying there as well. But their patent on Roundup was going to expire in year 2000. And so they created a system of crops that would withstand applications of Roundup. Normally, if you spray Roundup on crops, they will die. But Monsanto's scientists found bacteria growing in a chemical waste dump near their factory, not dying in the presence of Roundup, which normally also kills bacteria. So they figured, let's put it in the food supply. So they took the gene, they found out which of the genes in the DNA of the bacterium allowed the bacteria to survive Roundup, and they pulled it out of there. Then, what they typically do when they genetically engineer a crop is they take a gene and they make changes so it's completely different than what it appears in nature. They put an on switch to turn the gene on artificially, to force it to produce proteins over and over again, and that on switch they take from a virus. And they make millions of copies of this gene. After making millions of copies, they load it into a gun, truthfully. And they shoot the gun into a plate of plant cells, hoping that some of the genes get into the DNA of some of those cells. Then they clone those cells into a plant, and those plants, every single cell of that plant has that gene in it. And so what they did is they created Roundup-ready soybeans. Soybeans that you can spray the field with Roundup, and it kills all of the other plant biodiversity, but not the Roundup-ready soybeans. And this was a marketing move because when farmers bought the seeds, they signed a contract that they would only buy Monsanto's version of Roundup, because remember, it was going off of patent in year 2000. And they were forcing farmers to buy their version of Roundup. And that was the main reason why genetically engineered crops were born, to give Monsanto more money for poisonous weed killer. Now, there's another variety of genetically engineered crops, again from bacteria. The bacteria is called Bacillus thuringiensis, technical term, so we call it BT for short. And it exists in soil. And it is a natural poison. Again, poison, it's a theme. And if you gather the bacteria and you put it in a spray bottle and you spray it on certain plants, it'll kill certain insects. And you can go to the store and buy BT spray. But what the genetic engineers do is they take the gene that produces the BT toxin and make millions of copies and put it into a gun and shoot the gun into a plate of millions of cells and clone those cells into a plant. And now every single cell of every single plant has a little gene-sized spray bottle where if a bug bites the plant, it breaks open the stomach of the insect and kills them. So that's the other reason that they genetically engineer crops. Now, I have been educating consumers as well as healthcare professionals about the documented health risks of genetically engineered foods. And I started speaking to medical organizations around 2006. And when I speak to the organizations, as I speak around the country, I ask a question which I'll ask of you today. I would like you to rate yourself from 1 to 100 how vigilant you have been at avoiding foods containing genetically modified ingredients. Now, most Americans do not even know what a GMO is. So if you rate yourself 1 out of 100, which means not vigilant at all, you're doing better than most Americans who's more like -10 because they don't know what a GMO is. So I ask you to rate yourself from 1 to 100. 1 is not particularly vigilant at all about avoiding GMOs, and the 100 is very vigilant. All right? So most of you, I'm guessing, should be in the lowest category today of 1 to 20. So how many are in that category? Please raise your hand. 1 to 20. Okay? 20 to 40? 40 to 60? 60 to 80? 80 to 100? And how many don't like raising their hand? So the largest category was, as I predicted, 1 to 20. And I want to ask you one other question, because this is a pretest. We're going to have a similar exercise in about an hour. Rate yourself from 1 to 100 how active you have been at educating people about GMOs. Most of you should be in the lowest category, 1 to 20. So how many are in that category? Raise your hand. 20 to 40? 40 to 60? 60 to 80? 80 to 100. Okay? Again, most people were in the lowest category. For the doctors, instead of that second question, I asked them to rate themselves how active they are at prescribing non-GMO diets. GMO means genetically modified organism. So non-GMO diets. And most of the doctors at the beginning of the lecture are 1 to 20. They don't prescribe non-GMO diets. But after a 30-minute talk or a 45-minute talk or an hour talk, I ask them to rate themselves again. First, how vigilant they will be, and funnily enough, nearly every one of the doctors is now 80 to 100. And then I ask them how active they're going to be at prescribing non-GMO diets, and most of them are 80 to 100. So we've had some experience convincing doctors to prescribe non-GMO diets over the last 6 years. And there are thousands of doctors doing just that. So I was, for years, listening to scientists describe the laboratory experiences of animals that were fed GMOs. And scientists are very cautious in the way that they speak. They'll say, converging lines of evidence suggest that. It appears that. We can assume that it might ... They don't want to say proven. They don't want to say cause. They're very cautious. And so because I was trusted by them to reflect and express their concerns, that's how I speak. You may hear me say, this might do this could do this may do this. So when female rats were fed genetically modified soy, and more than half of their babies died within 3 weeks, and were also smaller and could not reproduce, compared to only 10% death rate among the offspring of mothers that ate non-GM soy, I can say, it appears that genetically engineered soybeans caused a 5-fold increase in infant mortality. But when I went to speak to the American Academy of Environmental Medicine, there was a difference. The AAEM is a group of doctors who specifically look for new diseases and new causes. So they were the first to identify Gulf War syndrome, food allergies, chemical sensitivity, more than a dozen other things. So I had spoken at their conference for 3 years in a row, and they invited me back for the 4th year to speak and to present an award, and I brought a video camera. And this was a few months after they decided to review the evidence on genetically modified foods and the laboratory animals. And they didn't say appears to, might, converging lines of evidence. In their policy online, it said it is not a casual relationship between GMOs and disorders and diseases we're seeing in these animals fed GMOs in laboratory settings. It is a causal relationship, and that the categories of disease include gastrointestinal problems, immune system problems, reproductive disorders, organ damage, accelerated aging, problems with cholesterol and insulin. They said every doctor should prescribe non-GMO diets to every patient. And there should be a complete moratorium on GMOs and labeling. So when I started interviewing the doctors who had prescribed non-GMO diets in their clinical practice, sometimes for years, they didn't say could, should, might, appears. One doctor said, GMOs cause inflammation, and inflammation is the basis of most of the diseases that we deal with. One doctor said, I tell my patients, he's an allergist, who are allergic, to stay away from GMOs because they'll react to them and they'll tell you that. I had one patient, Dr. Emily Lindner, she said she prescribes a non-GMO diet to every one of her patients. They all get better. It never doesn't work. I said, give me a percentage. I didn't believe her. I mean, I was like, was she overstating? I said, give me a percentage of how many of your patients get better on a non-GMO diet? She says 100. I said, how many patients have you been prescribing non-GMO diets to? She did some calculations and she said 5,000. I said, can I go to your office and interview some of those patients? She said, sure. So I took a camera crew to Chicago and I started interviewing her patients. And one said she had inflammatory bowel disease or irritable bowel syndrome. And she was told that she had to take 6 pills a day for the rest of her life until she met Dr. Lindner. And within 4 weeks, she was off the pills and off the symptoms. Another one of her patients conquered irritable bowel in a week and a half. Another one I talked to 25 days into the diet. And she said 3 days into the diet, her 30-year bout with colitis disappeared. She had skin problems that cleared up. Her weight, she had lost 10 pounds that month. Another one was losing hair, foggy in the morning, etc., all gone away on the new diet. Talked to another doctor who was prescribing non-GMO diets. A 12-year-old had asthma inhaler, was wheezing when he played hockey, had debilitating migraines 2 to 3 times per week for hours, completely gone in both cases when he switched the diet. I've heard this unsolicited reports from people. Restless leg syndrome. A guy said when he got rid of GMOs, it went away. Then he would test it. He would try a little bit of genetically modified corn. About 3 hours afterwards, his restless leg syndrome would come back for about half an hour to an hour. I was talking to people in California. I talked to a group of 120 people, and most of them had not been on non-GMO diets. I said, how many of you switched to non-GMO diets and felt and saw symptoms getting better? And 20 people raised their hands. And I said, okay, name some symptoms. Someone spoke on behalf of one of her clients. Unable to conceive, infertile for 5 years, got rid of GMOs, 3 weeks later, was pregnant. We had skin problems, ulcered skin, acne, weight problems, headaches, allergies, asthma. And this was remarkable, and these doctors were not cautious, because they were seeing it day after day in their own patients. Unlike scientists that work constantly in a theoretical world, these were doctors who had to make real-life decisions to real-life patients and saw changes. When I asked the patients to describe what is it that you did to avoid GMOs, things got interesting and complicated. The first thing they always said was, buy organic. Organic does not allow the intentional use of GMOs. And unlike the recent report, which was clearly inappropriately limited in its evaluations, organics do have an increase of about approximately 25% of nutrients, etc., and a reduction in toxic poisons. So that was a cofactor. Having interviewed scientists for more than a decade, I realized I could not conclude that GMOs were the cause of these problems that were getting better on a non-GMO diet, because it was also an organic diet. And for some people, they said they got rid of GMOs not only by switching to organic, but also switching to non-processed foods. Because 90% of processed foods have some corn derivative or soy derivative or sugar derivative or cottonseed oil or canola oil. Those are the major GMOs, and they're in processed foods. Maybe a tiny amount, maybe highly processed, but they're there. So when they switch to organic and they switch to non-processed, when they get rid of the processed, they get rid of the colorings and all these other stuff. And then some said, well, based on my symptoms, my doctor also took me off of gluten and dairy. And I'm like, how can I deal with that? How can I make any conclusion when the people who are reporting improvements have made so many changes at the same time? But the same month that I interviewed Emily Lindner, we took a camera crew and interviewed farmers and veterinarians who had taken their pigs and cows off of genetically modified soy and corn and just put in the non-GM soy and corn. So there was no gluten-free pigs or dairy-free cows. All the change was GM to non-GM. And we have seen such dramatic changes in the animals that have gone from GM to non-GM. Litter size increasing, conception rate increasing, fatal diarrhea disappearing in 2 days. Now, I said irritable bowel syndrome in the humans disappeared in a week and a half or 4 weeks. The pigs that had a huge consumption of genetically modified soybeans and sometimes fatal diarrhea, theirs disappeared in 2 days. Infectious diseases, pneumonia, high death rates, birth defects disappeared. Deaths from ulcer and bloat disappeared on these farms. I'll tell you one story. I was at a farmers' conference earlier this year, and I asked the farmers, how many of you have noticed that animals will avoid GMOs when given a choice? And I know that that's true because we've heard about it for years, and about 13 raised their hand, which was about average because that was what I had gotten at about 4 other farmer conferences that year. And people described how chickens, dogs, cows, pigs, geese, squirrels, elk, raccoons, mice, rats, buffalo all avoid GMOs when given a choice. Talk about the wisdom of nature. I often joke, we have to get humans up to the level of animals. I'm not sure if that's appropriate to say here, but I said it. But I asked this group another thing. I said, how many of you have noticed when you switch GM to non-GM with animals that they get better? And someone raised his hand. And he described, and I have this on film, and it's in the film that we'll be showing tomorrow at 3 o'clock, called Genetic Roulette, The Gamble of Our Lives. But I'll tell you more than it's in the film, the backstory. He had suggested to a family that had a pig farm to take the pigs from GM corn and soy to non-GM corn and soy. But they only decided to change the corn. So they grew non-GM corn last year, and in December of this year, they started feeding their 3,000 piglets non-GM corn. He got a call from one of the brothers at the farm, and he said he was stammering like crazy. He was so excited, and it was hard for him to get across what was up. So the guy said, you remember you told us to switch to non-GMO? And then my friend got nervous. Yeah, I remember. Well, we did, and here's what happened. Within 2 or 3 days, he and his brother were walking in the nursery, and they noticed there was a change in the behavior. Things were very different than they had been for more than a decade, and they didn't know what it was. And so one just joked with the other and said, well, maybe it's that non-GMO corn. And the other one laughed, and then they just continued. But by day 11, it was so dramatic, he made the phone call. You see, 14 years ago or so, they had switched from non-GM corn to GM corn. Prior to that, this brother was always the butt of jokes by his other brothers because he had the easiest job on the farm, the nursery. Simple. Until about 14 years ago. And then he had the hardest job on the farm because the pigs were getting very, very sick. and he was constantly injecting pigs with medicine, and their behavior changed dramatically. And they blamed it on the new genetics of the pigs brought into the area for these concentrated pig operations. But 11 days into the non-GM corn diet, they realized it wasn't the other pigs in the area that were causing the disease. Because now the pigs had reverted to how they had been 14 years ago. During that 14 years, when they came into the pig's stall, the pigs would get up because they were lying down and exhausted. They'd move around, and before they even left the stall, the pig would be lying down again. But now they were playing like piglets, and they'd come in, they'd jump around, they'd keep jumping around, playing with each other. They were acting like pigs. They were, in his mind, happier and healthier. And the injection rate, as you'll see on the film, plummeted immediately. And they were still feeding genetically modified soy. This was just the influence of the corn. They can't find non-GMO soy. Another person at the same conference said that his client had miniature steers fed on non-GM corn, switched to GM corn because he ran out. 90% of his herd died in 2 weeks. At another conference this year, a feedlot operator with 5,000 heads said he didn't realize it till he switched to non-GM corn, but the more corn he was feeding his cows, the more they would die. And the more pneumonia and infectious diseases they would have. Now, I interviewed a famous veterinarian who writes the syndicated column Animal Doctor, read by 25 to 30 million. And he told me that the cats and dogs are the animals that eat the byproducts of the human industrial food system. And so when we introduced GMOs, they got them, and there was no other change. Except he started getting letters from all over the country. Diarrhea, allergies, itching, inflammatory bowel. So he wrote, take them off of GM corn and soy, put them on non-GM corn and soy, or get rid of the soy and corn altogether. The animals got better. He has 40 to 60 letters in his files. Now, what is interesting is this. The categories of disease and disorders described by the American Academy of Environmental Medicine. Let's just take 3 of them. Immune system problems, reproductive problems, gastrointestinal problems. If you look at those problems and then you look at what the pets and the livestock are improving from, immune system problems, gastrointestinal problems, reproductive problems. If you look at what the humans are getting better from when they switch to non-GM, immune, gastrointestinal, and reproductive. And if you look at the diseases and disorders on the rise in the U.S. population since GMOs were introduced, the same ones. Food allergies, autoimmune disease, inflammatory-based diseases, infertility, all sorts of digestive disorders. I don't think it's a coincidence. I think GMOs cause these problems. Now I'll explain to you why I think GMOs cause these problems. And we'll go back to the beginning of the talk and look at the 2 different types of genetically modified crops. Let's first look at the pesticide-producing corn and cotton plants. We talked about Bt. Remember the Bt toxin that you spray in its natural form, but they've gathered up and inserted the gene into the cell, and now there's gene-sized spray bottles throughout the plant? Well, the Bt toxin pokes holes toxin pokes little holes, pores, in the cell walls of the plants. We're going to do this live while I'm here. We're going to change it. Okay. And that's how it kills the insects. It causes them to leak. It breaks the integrity of the walls of the intestines. And that's how it kills. During the digestive process in humans and mammals. And even if it weren't, it doesn't matter because it has no interaction with human cells. It kills certain types of insects. Until this year. The Journal of Applied Toxicology published a study that for the first time gathered the toxin from Monsanto's Bt corn and exposed it to human cells and found that it poked holes in human cells, causing leakage. But remember, it's destroyed during digestion, right? Until last year. Last year in Canada, scientists found Bt toxin in the blood of 93% of pregnant women tested and 80% of their unborn fetuses. So we have a toxin that breaks holes in human cells in our food supply, and somehow it gets into the blood. Maybe it drills holes for itself to get into the blood. And then it gets into the unborn fetuses, and they have no developed blood-brain barrier, so they may end up with Bt toxin on the brain. Now, in the study in Canada, they made a very interesting conclusion. They said the Bt obviously should wash out of the bloodstream very quickly, but why would 93% of pregnant women have Bt toxin in their blood? They must be taking it on a regular basis, but it's not Mexico. They're not eating corn tortillas every day. So they postulated that the Bt toxin came from the milk and meat of animals that were fed Bt corn. So they were saying not only does Bt toxin survive digestion, it survives digestion in the animals, and then we eat the animals, and it survives digestion in us and ends up in our blood supply. But I think there's another explanation that's more plausible. The only human feeding study ever published, actually until this week, there's a second one, but the only one until this week, found a very interesting thing. Scientists were concerned about what's called antibiotic-resistant marker genes. Now, these are genes which confer resistance to death by antibiotics to the cells where they are in the DNA. And they're used as part of the genetic engineering process for technical reasons. And the FDA scientists were absolutely aghast that they were going to have antibiotic-resistant marker genes throughout the food supply. They were concerned that these genes, once consumed in the food, might transfer to disease-creating bacteria, rendering the bacteria super diseases unkillable with antibiotics. But they were told, don't worry, genes are destroyed during digestion. Have we heard that before? So they finally did a study with 7 human volunteers where they tested the theory whether genes were destroyed during digestion. And it was a brilliant study. These 7 human volunteers had elastomy bags. They had their lower intestines removed. Not for the study. And they fed these people genetically engineered soy in the form of soy burgers and a soy milkshake. And they found, to their surprise, a considerable amount of intact genetically modified genes in the elastomy bag that had survived passage through the stomach and small intestine. But in 3 of the 7 human volunteers, before they were fed the soy meal, inside the DNA of the bacteria living inside their intestines was the gene that Monsanto scientists had found in their chemical waste dump near their factory and put into soybeans. In other words, from some previous meal, and this was in the UK, where they don't eat a lot of genetically modified soy, but from some previous meal or meals of genetically modified soy, the Roundup Ready gene and its on switch, the promoter from the virus, had both transferred into the DNA of the bacteria living inside their intestines, and that bacteria was not killable with Roundup. Suggesting, here I go again with that word, suggesting that it was continuing to function. Meaning long after we stop eating genetically modified crops, we may have genetically modified proteins produced continuously inside of us. Now, they withdrew the funding as soon as they found this out. This was the pro-GM UK government that had participated in destroying former scientists' reputations who had discovered that GMOs were dangerous. So they weren't going to be funding research that showed that GMOs were a problem. So no one checked to see if eating corn chips made from BT corn also transferred. If the genes that produce BT toxin transfer to the DNA of the bacteria living inside our intestines and continue to function, it means we are producing BT toxin continuously inside our gut, and that's, in my opinion, why 93% of the pregnant women had BT toxin in their blood, because I think they were producing it inside their own digestive tract. Now, if BT toxin is produced inside of us, first of all, several studies have shown that BT toxin promotes allergic responses. So this could explain an increase in allergic responses, in food allergies, in immune system triggering. If it drills holes in the walls of human cells, and it pokes holes in the intestines, causing leaky gut, many scientists think that that will increase food allergies, autoimmune disease, inflammation, cancer, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and autism. And these are on the rise in the US population, so BT toxin alone could explain so many of the symptoms and diseases found in the laboratory animals or improved in the humans and livestock. That's just one of the 2 categories. And there's just one aspect of it, BT toxin. Roundup Ready. Roundup, we talked about earlier, is linked to birth defects. So when the Danish farmer took his pigs off of Roundup Ready soy, he went from 13 birth defects the previous year to 0. Now, Roundup interferes with hormone production, estrogen, testosterone, aromatase, so it messes up reproduction. It can kill human placental cells. It may be responsible for the astounding evidence of harm of the reproductive systems of lab animals fed GM soy. There was changes in the young sperm cells. Testicles changed from pink to blue. Uteruses and ovaries changed their structure. The DNA functioned differently in the embryo offspring when the parents were fed GM soy compared to non-GM soy. We already mentioned a 5-fold increase in infant mortality among the offspring of female rats fed genetically modified soy. When hamsters were fed GM soy, by the third generation, most were sterile. And those that did give birth, there was a 4 to 5-fold increase in infant mortality, and many of the infants had hair growing in their mouths. When mice were fed Roundup-ready corn, they had fewer babies and smaller babies. The infertility rate in the United States is absolutely skyrocketing. And as you'll see on the film tomorrow, this aspect of Roundup is just one of 3 aspects that may cause reproductive disorders. There's a completely new organism that it may promote, a pathogen that is known to kill embryos in laboratory animals and tends to explode around Roundup-ready crops. You'll see that in the film. So the Roundup, which is also linked to cancer and Parkinson's, may explain the reproductive disorders. So if we look at the immune system problems, the reproductive problems, and the gastrointestinal problems, we can explain it right there with those 2 qualities of GMOs. But there's another one. By the way, just to be clear, when you spray a field with Roundup, the plants drink the Roundup. Some of it gets pushed through the roots into the soil. Others gets deposited in the food portion. So the amount of Roundup in the Roundup-ready crops is profoundly greater than in the other crops. That's what we're talking about, eating Roundup. The third reason is this. No matter what gene you insert, whether it's vitamin A or something completely healthy, the process of insertion, whether it's done by a gun or bacterial infection, they use both, plus cloning, causes massive collateral damage in the plant. You see, we've got thousands and thousands of genes that produce proteins. Well, when you insert and clone, those genes, many of them become altered. Up to 5% can change their levels of expression. Some genes are destroyed, some are turned on permanently, some are turned off permanently. There can be hundreds or thousands of mutations. So when you look at Monsanto's BT corn, not only does it have BT, which is an allergen and a toxin, one of the genes that's normally switched off in corn was accidentally switched on, and that produces an allergen. So in Monsanto's BT corn, which is in corn chips, there's an allergen which is not in natural corn. In fact, 43 different proteins are either vastly increased or decreased in BT corn. And that's just the background noise as a result of the process. It has nothing to do with what's intentioned. It is simply unpredicted side effects, collateral damage. They want to introduce one gene, they disrupt 1,000 others, or 100 others, or 40 others. In Monsanto's soybeans, there's a known allergen in soy called trypsin inhibitor. In Monsanto's cooked soy, it's as much as 7 times higher. That was hidden by Monsanto. They tried to hide that evidence. In fact, Monsanto works overtime to rig their research to avoid finding problems. I talked to one scientist, he said, he used to work at Monsanto. They found that the corn caused significant damage to rats. I believe it was rats. And instead of withdrawing the corn, they rewrote the study to hide the damage. He told me that 3 of his colleagues at Monsanto did research on bovine growth hormone injected into cows to increase milk supply. He said they found so much of a cancer-promoting hormone in the milk called IGF-1, the 3 Monsanto scientists refused to drink milk thereafter unless it was organic. one bought his own cow. It's true. Can you imagine, and I hope you can't, I hope you can't imagine working for a company and discovering its products were so toxic that you wouldn't eat it and still working at that company. This gives you some insight. Another aspect of this company is the way they treat independent scientists who discover problems. The Russian scientist who discovered the 5-fold increase in infant mortality. Papers were burnt on her desk, samples stolen from her laboratory. She was told by her boss, who was under pressure from his boss, no more research on GMOs. One of her colleagues tried to comfort her by telling her, well, maybe the GM soy will solve the overpopulation problem. So we have a situation where we have introduced the products of an infant, dangerous science into the food supply that crosses the known species barriers, that creates unpredicted side effects, that introduces known toxins into the food supply, and yet no one is monitoring to see if GMOs are causing the increase of inflammatory bowel disease up 40% since GMOs were introduced, or multiple chronic illnesses, nearly doubling in the first 9 years of GMOs, or allergies doubling, or food-related illnesses doubling. No one is looking. There's no human clinical trials, hardly any long-term animal feeding studies. We've caught the industry red-handed rigging their research, which I call tobacco science. How would we know if GMOs were the cause? If you go to the doctor with cancer or with heart disease or diabetes, does the doctor say, have you been eating? Have you been eating soy and corn? No, they just treat you. There was an epidemic in the 1980s caused from a genetically engineered food supplement, L-tryptophan. The company Showa in Japan was genetically engineering bacteria to produce the tryptophan. The process of genetic engineering almost certainly caused certain contaminants, which killed about 100 Americans and caused 5,000 to 10,000 people to fall sick or become permanently disabled. We almost missed this epidemic. As vast as it was, it almost passed unnoticed. And the reason it was discovered was because there were 3 simultaneous characteristics of the symptoms. It created a new disease. So it wasn't just heart disease or diabetes. It was completely new. And it was acute, very severe, the worst pain the doctors had seen in their careers. And it came on immediately, right after people took the tryptophan. These are the 3 characteristics absolutely necessary for us to identify whether GMOs are causing problems. What if GMOs are not causing new problems and they're just causing an increase of milk duct tissue cancer, which is up 55 to 60% since bovine growth hormone was introduced? It would have to be acute, because if it were low-level symptoms like frequent colds, no one would notice, or memory loss. No one would notice. And if it weren't fast acting, what if it took 3 generations? What if was it like the hamsters? It took 3 generations to cause those dramatic problems. We haven't had 3 generations as human beings on GMOs. So we don't know. But we don't have to wait. We can take ourselves out of this experiment. We have a non-GMO shopping guide. We can teach people how to avoid GMOs. So now I'm going to ask you. I'd like you to rate yourself from 1 to 100. How vigilant you'll be next week at avoiding GMOs. So how many people will be low vigilance, not particularly vigilant? 1 to 20, raise your hand. Low vigilance. For those on the camera, there's no one raising their hand. 20 to 40? 40 to 80? 40 to 60? 60 to 80? 80 to 100? For those that dared to raise their hand, 80 to 100. Now, I'm a strategist. I'm not a scientist. And my focus of our Institute for Responsible Technology is to end the genetic engineering of the food supply. Thank you. I'm going to tell you a little story which is depressing and then glorious. Dr. Arpad Pusztai, the world's leading researcher in his field, was given $3 million by the UK government to figure out how to test for the safety of GMOs. And he was a pro-GMO scientist working at the top nutritional research laboratory in the UK and probably in the world, or maybe in the world. And he won his grant over 27 competing scientists because he was that good. And he fed supposedly harmless genetically modified potatoes to rats as part of the protocol that he was going to be recommending that will be adopted by the European regulators as the required safety studies for any product introduced into the diet that was made from genetic modification. And Dr. Pusztai was not expecting any problems with these rats. But within 10 days, they developed potentially precancerous cell growth, smaller brains, livers, and testicles, partial atrophy of the liver, and damaged immune system. And it was not the gene that was the cause of the problem, it was that background collateral damage. The same process that caused that damage was the process used to create the crops on the market. So he had discovered that the generic process of genetic modification was dramatically dangerous and hurt virtually every system studied in his lab animals. He went public with his concerns in a televised interview in the UK and was a hero for 2 days at his prestigious institute. And the director took over all the press, describing the research as world-class and life-changing, until 2 phone calls were received by the director from the UK Prime Minister, from his office. The next morning, the director fired Dr. Pusztai after 35 years and silenced him with threats of a lawsuit. They dismantled his 20-member research team, withdrew the data, never implemented the protocols as part of the EU regulation, and instead embarked upon a campaign to destroy Pusztai's reputation in order to protect the reputation of biotechnology. 7 months and 1 heart attack later, Pusztai's gag order was lifted by an order of Parliament. Within 1 week, 159 feet of articles were written. Within a month, over 700 articles were written about GMOs in the UK alone. It, according to one editor, divided society into 2 warring blocs about GMOs. And within 10 weeks of the gag order being lifted, there was so much consumer concern about GMOs, Unilever, Britain's largest food maker, made a public announcement that changed the world. This was late April 1999. Earlier that year, Monsanto's plans had been revealed to genetically engineer 100% of all commercial seeds in the world. At the same conference in January, another biotech company projected that by 2004, they'd have 95% of all commercial seeds genetically engineered. But they weren't counting on the gag order being lifted 3 weeks after that announcement. And they weren't counting on the fact that 10 weeks later, there was so much consumer concern about GMOs, it had reached a tipping point. And Unilever said, no more GMOs in Europe. And by the end of the day, Nestle said it, and by the end of the week, so did virtually everyone else. So now McDonald's and Burger King and all Safeway, all these groups, Hershey's, Nestle's, they all serve non-GMO in Europe. Because that's where the press reported the dangers. Project Censor described the whole Puztai affair as one of the 10 most underreported events of the year in the United States. But it gives us hope, right? It was not the government in the EU that banned GMOs. It was the same motivation, profit, which had introduced GMOs, which kicked them out. They had become a marketing liability. So we educated people about the cancer risk of bovine growth hormone. And as our coalition spread the word, parents started realizing that milk from cows treated with bovine growth hormone was not worth the risk. And it's been kicked out of Walmart, Starbucks, Yoplait, Dannon, and most American dairies, another tipping point. So what we have now before us is a very simple strategy. How many Americans would it take avoiding GMOs to cause Unilever and Nestle's and others to get rid of GMOs? We think as little as 5%. Here's why. First of all, no one seeks GMOs. No one wakes up in the morning wanting their daily dose of Roundup or Bt toxin. So there's no compelling reason to keep it. And if these same companies that removed it in Europe see even a slight drop in market share that they can attribute to anti-GMO sentiment growing in the US, that will be like a food industry sell signal. Time to let it go. See, that thing went off just at the right time. So with 5%, if we're looking for just enough to demonstrate a drop in market share, that's only 15 million. That should be easy. Now, it should be easy if we can actually convince people to avoid GMOs. Do we have the information to change people's diet? And we know that why? Because we just did. Because it took about an hour. I've done it in 11 minutes. I did it recently in 3.5. I spoke very quickly. Where we did a pre and post test, and many of you, most of you, were willing to make a change, a significant change in your life, where you're willing to kick out maybe brands that you've grown up with. And it just was a matter of what? Hearing the truth. So all we need to do is to get the truth to enough people, and we will reclaim a non-GMO food supply. So I want to ask you to rate yourself from 1 to 100 how active you want to be at getting the word out about GMOs. Remember, we had the pre-test about an hour ago. So how many people plan to be low active in their outreach on GMOs? That would be 1 to 20. Raise your hand if you're 1 to 20. 20 to 40. 40 to 60, 60 to 80, 80 to 100, nearly everyone. Now, it's interesting that the same information that changes people's diet gets the message to go viral, gets the message to other people. So I mentioned that I was a strategist. So what I've done is packaged this behavior-changing information into books, movies, audios, articles, blogs, PowerPoints, etc. And we have been getting the word out, and we have trained about 800 people to speak about the dangers of GMOs in a 10-hour online webinar, also in-person seminars. We have a Spilling the Beans newsletter, and I forgot to pass around a sign-up sheet, so we'll have to do that before the end of the night, and I'll put it in the back if you'd like to sign up for the newsletter, where you can share it with other people. We have a right brain book, Seeds of Deception, which is all about how scientists have been fired and stripped of responsibilities, and how the FDA, check this out, the person in charge of policy at the FDA for GMOs was Monsanto's former attorney. Later Monsanto's vice president. Now he's the US food safety czar. And the whole policy on GMOs at the FDA is based on a false statement saying the agency was not aware of any information that's showing that GMOs were different, when in fact thousands of documents made public from a lawsuit show it's just the opposite. They were concerned and they were warning their leaders over and over again. So we have the right brain book, Seeds of Deception. We have a left brain book, Genetic Roulette. We have movies. And now I think their most powerful tool, our most powerful tool is the movie we'll be showing tomorrow at 3 o'clock called Genetic Roulette, The Gamble of Our Lives. Because there I have scientists and doctors and veterinarians and farmers and people telling their stories and describing everything I've said tonight and much more. So we think that this tool would be very, very helpful in getting the word out to others. Because it's only 90-minute investment of someone's time. You don't have to read a whole book. And I asked a group in a recent screening, it just came out a couple of weeks ago. I asked them, how many of you are going to take a significant change in your eating habits as a result of the film? And everyone raised their hand. And how many are going to get the word out? And everyone raised their hand. So I think it's actually better than my lecture, so you actually didn't need me at all. So we have several copies available for people. I think it's for sale tonight. And I would like to suggest that since you want to get the word out, and you may not have memorized every single thing that I've said, it might be easier to just loan the film or show the film or explain to others why they must watch the film before they take their next bite. Now, to avoid GMOs, you can go to non-GMOshoppingguide.com, and there you will find thousands of third-party verified non-GMO products. And if it's not on that list, you can look at the product label and see if it says organic, and that's a green light. If it says non-GMO on the package, that's a green light. Or you'll find a list of at-risk ingredients, the derivatives of soy and corn, and then you can avoid those in the ingredient list. And we have an iPhone application that's free called Shop No GMO. You can download it to your iPad or your iPhone, Shop No GMO. And I would recommend sharing this with others. And I think that happens automatically, especially with this community. I know that I gave a talk at one conference, and a food service director told me later he was texting his children as he left the room, "Don't eat any more GM foods." And his son texted back, "What's wrong with General Motors?" You know, I want to reflect on something now before we take questions. And that is this. If you look at the history of mankind, we've never seen a technology, perhaps other than nuclear war, that has the capacity to do such harm for such a long period of time. The negative implications and consequences of genetic engineering can influence everyone who eats food, and that's most of us. And when it's released outdoors, it affects the ecosystem. And there's many ways that it hurts the environment, which we haven't discussed. So it affects essentially all living beings. But also, you've introduced new genes to a gene pool, and what happens to a gene pool? It self-replicates. Cross-pollination, seed flow. We've given pollution a life of its own. We've released these organisms into the environment with no capacity to fully recall them. So this is a technology that can affect all living beings and all future generations. This is unprecedented. In human history, unprecedented. Which also means that the opportunity for doing good by stopping it is unprecedented. When have our ancestors ever had the capacity to do something like this, where they can help protect all living beings and all future generations? Certainly on a spiritual level, but on the nature level, I don't believe it's been available. So this I see not as a burden, but as an opportunity. As an opportunity to become empowered and to say, it's up to us to be the stewards of nature, of our food, of our gut bacteria, of our livestock, of our pets, of life itself. And most people don't know about this. And yet most people are uneasy about GMOs in the first place. 53% of Americans say they would avoid GMOs if they were labeled. Now the good news is we've been educating people about the health dangers, and the early signs of the tipping point are coming to pass. Non-GMO labels have become one of the fastest growing label claims in America for the past 3 years. Thousands of people are now gathering in activist groups, what we call the Tipping Point Network, to get the word out to their communities, to doctors, to patients, to parents, to certain religious groups. We are now seeing an uprising against GMOs like we've never seen before, and it's expressing itself naturally in a demand for labeling, which is enjoyed by the people of 49 other countries, but not the U.S. And so 19 different state legislatures have had bills for labeling. None have gotten past Monsanto yet, but in California, there's a ballot initiative to be voted on by the citizens in November for labeling of GMOs. And if it passes, we believe that will create the tipping point like that. So what I will do tomorrow, I believe it's at 2 o'clock, is talk about means for effective organizing, community organizing, organizing among the church, organizing to support what's happening in California, getting your friends the film, getting your friends the information. We're starting off with about 65% of Californians in favor of Prop 37. But now, tens of millions of dollars are being spent by Monsanto and others to confuse people. They're confusing people by telling people that Prop 37 is confusing. They're spending far more money than they'd ever spend on labeling by telling people that labeling is too expensive. They're trying to tell people lies to get them to vote against their best self-interest. So we have an opportunity now to call into California, to reach out to California as a pivotal place on earth in this moment that can turn it around in the United States, and that would turn it around in the world. So between now and the election is an opportunity we've never seen before. I've been working on this issue for 16 years. I've never been more optimistic, and I've spent most of my time now in California. I'll be leaving Monday to spend the rest of the time till the election in California. So I am so happy to share this information with you. GMO represents a lot of things. I asked a group of religious leaders on a videotape shoot last week in Los Angeles. I said, some people think that GMO really means God might object. Do you think God would object? And they all said yes. So I am grateful that this community already has the seeds of health, the seeds of nature, of life, growing. You already have the respect for nature, for nature's intelligence, and realize more than most what a catastrophic thing this change can be. Because as I learned today, if the health remedies are asking people to eat the healthy natural foods, and the natural foods are gone, then nature's medicine chest has been destroyed, and we can't let that happen. And I don't think we will let this happen, and I'm sure we will not let this happen, because I'm seeing what's happening here and around the country is people taking back and becoming empowered and saying, we will protect nature, we will protect our food, we will reclaim a non-GMO food supply. Thank you very much.